Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Metzia daf kuf daled. We are okay. We're going to get started from the Mishnah at the bottom of the daf. I just wanted to check one thing. Okay, so what we saw yesterday was hamekabel sadeh mechavero v'hi beit hashlachin. Right, if you have a field that is okay, that's what I'm. We have a field that you're working in arisut. Okay, but maybe before I start, this is where I want to start. I just wanted to say there's a bunch of extra content, and some of it I didn't mention before in class, so I want to just mention it now about some of the extra content on our site that went up in the last few days. There's, just to remind you, again, it's maybe a little busy time, but keep it in mind if you have time before Chag or maybe while you're cooking. Din and Daf went up last week about the power of original ownership. What's the logic of that? And that's a topic we've been discussing. We discussed it a lot yesterday. The chazaka of marakama, of the person who was first in the land. In other words, they have the first rights. So where does that come from? What's the logic of that? That's a very interesting thing to delve into. We had the Gefet of Jared and Mamona from last week. There was Shuli Mishkin. The article was about the cat and the mice and the whole thing about that. And it's also, there's one in flashback on tomorrow's daf about locusts. And then today we'll see doresh lashon hedyot, which is a topic that Rabbanit Ifi Climber went in depth about. So you can listen to that. And maybe we'll have, possibly, I don't know, but we'll see. There might be, we had a shiur about heiter iska already from Alana Steinheim. Perhaps we'll have a translation of the Geffen in English to see if it's too much overlap, or maybe there'll be another shiur on it from a bit of a different perspective on the heiter iska. That's where we're going to end our daf today. So that it'll go up after the Chag. Okay, so a lot of interesting material. I didn't want to forget to mention them. So let's get back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah starts off with someone who is working as a sharecropper. That actually, it could be really any sharecropper here, okay, which could be, one second, I'm going to mute everybody. Okay. It could be a sharecropper that gives percentages. It could be a sharecropper who works and gives a certain amount back to the owner. But they took on a field that was an easier field, so to speak. So the question is, if what was easy about it doesn't exist anymore, like the tree fell down, or the river that was watering it dried up, and now you have to work harder, can you deduct it? We said it really depended on if you included in the contract that it was this type of field. And that's what we're going to deal with today in the beginning of the daf. Hechidami, 2 lines from the bottom of Kuf Gimel Amud Bet. What's the case? What we're talking about is the first case in the Mishnah where it says you actually can't deduct anything because you didn't mention anything about it in the contract. So what's the case? If there was a huge river and it all of a sudden dried up, you could say, what do you mean? This was like a natural disaster. This is not my fault. Now I have to work so much harder. I shouldn't have to pay you what I committed to pay you originally. And, the argument could actually go both ways, because the owner could say, what do you mean? It was beyond anyone's control. I'm not responsible any more than you. But the Gemara thinks right now that really it would be the aris, the sharecropper or chocher, should be able to get a break on that. And they actually think that that's the case. Nobody disagrees with that. But Amar of Papa, it must be the case. The Yavish Nara Zute, it was a small river, where you can't say, oh, natural disaster. It was a small river. And now he says to him, and the owner says, look, okay, well, go get the water in a pail. Okay, not my fault. Amar of Papa, honey, now here's a kind of funny line. You don't really see these lines in the Gemara so much, where Rav Papa is looking at the Mishnah the way we would look at the Mishnah, okay? Meaning we have a book of Mishnayot, and he kind of deals with it. Oh, look at the Mishnayot that we have, and I'm going to split the Mishnayot of this chapter that deal with issues of chachirut and arisut, different types of sharecropping. And he says, Hani tartim niata kamaita, the first 2 Mishnayot, which are the 2 that we learned already, mishkach ala bein b'chachlanuta bein b'kablanuta. It doesn't matter whether you're a chocher, you're an aris, it would be the same for both, okay? Either I paid you a full amount, right? Our case we just discussed, it would be the same. In the case where I could deduct it. That way I could deduct even if it was percentages. Even if I promised you percentages, still I was planning not to work so hard, and now all of a sudden I have to work harder. And if we specified that it was beit hashlachin, then right, I could pay you less. But mikam ve'elach, all the rest of the Mishnah we're going to see. Okay, they apply across the board, they apply either to a chocher, the one who pays a set amount, or to an aris. An aris is also a kablan, or someone who pays percentages, and what's true for one is not true for the other. So basically, it's just setting up a framework for this chapter. Just understand the first ones are like that, doesn't matter, and the next ones, because notice the words in our Mishnah was hamekabel, which is usually arisut, but it's true for arisut or chachivut. Now let's get back to our case. That was kind of parenthetical statement. So now we get to the second part, where if you specified it in the contract that it was a field that had a river going through it, or it was a field with trees, then you could claim that you get a break on it as the sharecropper. I don't have to pay the owner as much money. Why? Why can't he just claim the owner of the field? I was just calling it by name. Okay. In other words, it wasn't because it was an irrigated field. It was because that's the name I call it. Okay. I just happen to call it that. I happen to call it a baby land, but not because of the trees that are in it. Now it's a little strange. You might say, what? Well, Milo Tanya, they're not just saying this, but they're going to prove it from a Braita. It says in a Braita, somebody says, I'm selling you beit core. Beit core is an amount that grows a core of grain. I'm selling you a piece of land that's a beit core. Even if he only has one half the size, hedyot. In other words, if we made a deal about this piece of land and you sold me a piece of land and you called it a beit core, but it happens only to have a letech in it, you can still claim that was the field we were talking about. And I have nothing to say to you. Why? Because it's just what you call the field. Maybe originally it was a beit core and you sold off part of it, but you still kept the original name. Now, they point out here, it's only if really it is called a beit core. If you don't call the field a beit core, then obviously you can't claim that. But if you call the field a beit core, and then you write beit core in the contract of what you were selling me, and then I come and say, what are you talking about? That's not a beit core. And you say, what do you mean? This is what I call a beit core. Well, you have the upper hand. Karmani mocherlach. You say, I'm selling you a vineyard. Even if it doesn't have any vines in it, there's no grapes growing. Higiel, again, you could sell it to me. Because you just call it a vineyard, even though it doesn't have vines. It's a little strange. But that's if you call it a keren. Or pardesani mocherla. If you say you're selling me an orchard, which usually means it has pomegranates in it. So even though it has no pomegranate trees in it, higiel, still you can sell it to me, because you called it by name. In the contract, when you said pardes, or you said beit core, or you said kerem, you were basically just calling the name of what you call this item. Pardes. This is like people who name Cohen and they're not always necessarily Kohanim, right? It happens. It's not like you could say, what do you mean? I married you. I thought you were a Cohen and you're not. What do you mean? That's just my name, right? So sometimes this could happen. So why can't you say the same thing here? You just called it a beit shlachim, but it's not that it was because it was an irrigated field or because it was a field with trees. That's just what I happen to call the field, or the owner happened to call the field. So how do we resolve that? Basically, what we're saying is this Braita contradicts the Mishnah. To which Amar Shmuel lo kasha, we're going to have two answers. Shmuel says, oh, this isn't difficult because Hada Amar le makchir lechocher, Hada Amar le chocher lemakchir. It really depends who's speaking. If it's the owner speaking, then the owner can say, that's just what I call it. But if it's the sharecropper who writes it or says it, then the sharecropper is saying it, specifically calling it that, because that's what the sharecropper is interested in. The sharecropper wants a field that's easy to deal with. And if it's the sharecropper speaking, that's our Mishnah. If it's the owner speaking, that's the Braita. So let's read that inside. Amarle makchir lechocher. If the makchir, the owner, says it to the sharecropper, shma ba'alma amarle, then we assume it's just the name, just what he calls it. Amarle chocher lemakchir kapeda. But if the chocher says it to the makchir, to the person who If the sharecropper says it, they're makpik, peda, they care. They're saying, I specifically want it to be like this. And if it's not like that, I want less. That's one way to resolve a contradiction between the Mishnah and the Bride. Ravina brings a different explanation. Ravina Amar, Edi, both of them are Da'amar le'machir le'choche. Both of these cases, it's the owner who says this. And yet we can still distinguish because, now look at the language, and I specifically didn't point this out yet. I want to point it out now. The language the Mishnah says, let's just look back. If he says, Chachorli ste beit hashlachin zo, this specific, it also says the word this. It doesn't just say in irrigated field, it says this irrigated field. So now comes Ravina and he's going to say, Midika amar zeh, because the person already specified this. Okay, now we have the owner. The owner says, I'm giving you this field to be a sharecropper on. Michlal the kai b'gavaskin, and it's obvious which one he's relating to because he says this. This obviously must be pointing. Beit hashlachin lamali l'meimar. So then why did he add beit hashlachin? In other words, in the case where we said, I'm selling you beit core, or I'm selling you a vineyard, or I'm selling you an orchard, there he had to say the word to identify which one. Here, he identified it some other way because he said this, which was clear what field he was referring to. So the extra word beit hashlachin or beit ilan is just extra. In which case, why did he say it? If not to say beit hashlachin lama li l'meimar, right? So what do you need it for? Because what he was saying is, I'm giving you a beit hashlachin as is now, meaning this is an irrigated field, this is a field with trees. If that changes, well, then you can claim, you can give me less money. Okay, that's the first section of today's stuff. Now we're moving on to the next Mishnah. And it's a very famous Mishnah because it comes up in the asmachta sugya, which we seem to come upon a bunch of different times. And this is one of the key sugyot, as you'll see later in the Gemara, because we always try to define what causes something to be asmachta. And in this sugya, we get a definition. Now, it's not always applicable, but it is a definition of what is considered asmachta. If you remember what's asmachta, it's when you don't really mean something you say. Okay, but hold off on that because right now we're not up to that. You get a field be'arisut. Now we're talking about arisut only because if you get a field and you decide not to work the field, of course you have to pay because you promised to pay X amount of money. You didn't promise to pay part of the percentage of the produce. But if you're working on percentages and you basically get 2/3 and the owner gets 1/3, that's the basic usually. Well, you're hovira, you just decided not to work the field. Shamino, so now there's nothing to give to the owner. Well, that's not fair to the owner. Shamino takama ru'yala sopinoteno. So you come up with an evaluation of what the field should have produced, like an average amount, and you have to pay. Why? And this is the big line that's going to lead us into a whole other sugya. Shekach kotevlo, because this is what people would write in sharecropper agreements. This was the commonly used language. And I want you to notice that we're in the time of the Mishnah where we always say, oh, they spoke Hebrew and the Mishnah's Hebrew and all that. But clearly their contracts were in Aramaic, as we saw with the Ketubah, also this. Im ovir velo avid, if I don't work your field, if I just don't do anything and I don't work it, ashalim b'meitva, I will pay the best, okay, which really means I will pay what it should have produced. So since that's part of the contract, that basically becomes law. And what exactly that means, we're going to see right now, or we're going to see the different interpretations of what this means. Gemara starts off and says, Rabbi Meir doresh lashon hedyot. Okay, this is where Rabbanit Climber went all off about what is lashon hedyot, right? But it's the commonly used language, which you would think is not so important, right? We usually have the lashon of the Torah, we have lashon of chachamim, but this is giving value to what common people speak and how they speak and what language they use. Titania. Rabbi Meir omer, imovil v'lo avid ashalim b'meitva. So they say, Rabbi Meir was doresh lashon hedyot, and the proof is our Mishnah. And they see in a Braita that it's Rabbi Meir. Okay, that's all the Braita added. What does this mean, doresh lashon hedyot? There's many different interpretations. Some people say that what this means is that since this was normally put in contracts, then basically this is always implicit, even if not put in the contract. We've seen that concept before. Where have we seen it? If you remember, achrayut ta'ut sofer. I sell you land without a guarantee. It's as if we assume the sofer forgot to put it in and it should be there because that's the language of a usual contract. Now, to say that that's what doresh lashon hedyot means is a bit weak because it's not really doresh. We already have this other term, ta'ut sofer. Why wouldn't we use the same thing here? So not everybody likes that interpretation. Rashi goes with this interesting approach that says, if we look in Rashi, doresh lashon hedyot, shehurgilo hedyot lichtov shelo ketakanat chachamim. The rabbis didn't say that one has to do this, but people started putting this in contracts. And then, and then Rabbi Meir said, well, this must be the psak halakha. In other words, instead of usually the rabbis determine something and then we have to do it, it's the opposite. Here, people started writing this in contracts, and then it became common law, which is another interesting thing. Some people say this doesn't really work with doresh. Like, why doresh? Doresh lashon sounds like a drasha in the language. Now, we had a different sugya, if you remember. I don't remember the details, but I do remember. I think it was about a ketubah, where they darshan the words of the ketubah. They came up with all sorts of drashot from the language written in a contract. And that's basically what many commentaries say, and we're going to go with that here. That, I mean, you can take whatever you want here, but taking literally doresh lashon hedyot, that you can darshan the wording of what it says in the contract. In other words, what does that mean? Well, Torah is given to be darshan, right? It's written in certain language so that you can infer from it all sorts of things. When people write, they don't always write in that way. I mean, maybe famous authors, right? They want to write in a way that you can understand different things from here. But the common person just writes and, means one thing, maybe didn't express it exactly perfectly. But what they're saying is, if you write something in a contract, or if this is what's commonly used in a contract, we can derive from this that they mean it. Okay, sometimes people just say, oh yeah, put in the contract that I'm definitely going to do it, and if not, I'll commit to you, whatever. They don't really mean it. Okay, well, we'll see some other ones because we're going to have 4 other examples now. Doresh lashon hedyot. But no, we take it. Okay, now darshan isn't always literally, but what we mean is we take it seriously, and that means what it says. So that's what it says. That's what we do. So it'll say, okay, what's the chiddush? I mean, if it says in the contract, obviously it's binding. So there's a lot of debate about what exactly this means with all the interpretations, that we're going to move on. So Rabbi Yehuda hayad doresh lashon hedyot. Now we're on the second one. We're going to have 5 examples of this. Ditanya, in totally different cases. The background you need to know is there's certain sacrifices. For example, a korban yoledet, a woman gives birth. Depending on whether she's wealthy or poor, she gives a different sacrifice, or animals or birds. Okay, it's either animals or birds. Sometimes there's animals or birds or a meal offering. Okay, there's different, that's the sliding scale offering. Depends how wealthy you are. Well, Rabbi Yehuda says the following. Adam mevi korban ashir al ishto. What if the man is wealthy and the woman is not? So, and the korban is on her because she gave birth, or maybe some other korban. She is a leper. Also, leper has different things you bring. So, Rabbi Yehuda says, if the man is wealthy, he has to bring the sacrifice. Why? Because we're doresh lashon hedyot. What does the husband commit to the wife in ketubah? Okay, and this is, by the way, not only they're going to say, not only a korban that happens when they're married, that she becomes obligated, even things from before the marriage. Says, I accept upon myself any responsibilities, any financial responsibilities of yours from before this day. Now, you could have understood this as he's just basically saying, I accept all responsibility. And he says it in a flower, the best way to say this is, people use flowery language, but it doesn't matter. He said it, we're going to make him responsible for it. Okay? He is responsible for everything from before. People in Alexandria, they would betroth their wives. This would always happen a lot before the wedding. So there was a betrothal, which according to halakha, this is not like engagement. This is binding, okay? If you want to get out of it, you need to get. She's a married woman right now. If somebody else betroths her, well, she's a married woman. And if she has children with them, the children are mamzerim because she's married to somebody else technically. Again, even though she's not married, she's betrothed, that's enough to be considered a married woman. Well, what would happen in Alexandria? Obviously, this wasn't every case, but there was a phenomenon that this would happen. When they were about to go to the chuppah, men would come and grab them, okay, not like lashon chatufim as kidnap, but they would take these women and they would betroth them and marry them. So you're like getting to your wedding and someone else grabs you, betroths you, and I guess the woman agreed, right? Maybe they seduced them somehow into agreeing because the woman has to agree. But what happened? Now they had children with the next husband. So, but they were already betrothed to somebody else. So they wanted to say the kids are mamzerim. Now here in this case, you can see that the rabbis were going to go out to bat to we always try if we can to avoid mamzerim problems. So what did Hillel HaZaken do? Amar lem Hillel HaZaken, haviu li k'tubat imchem. He said to the children who were mamzerim, they were, I guess, grown up at this point, bring me your mother's ketubah and let me see if I can resolve the situation. Now the ketubah from the first marriage, which wasn't a marriage yet, but the first betrothal, which was written at the time of the betrothal. And in those contracts, what did it say? And here he's going to be doresh this language. So heviu lo ketubah iman. They brought the ketubah. Zumatzash ketubah, and you saw it said, Lisha tikansi lechuppah havalili into. When you get to the chuppah, you'll be my wife. And he said, listen, it says, when you get to the ketubah, you'll be my wife, which means that when they betroth them under condition. The kiddushin will only be valid if you end up coming into the chuppah with me. And you didn't, so it undid, right? The women didn't, so it undid the kiddushin. The kiddushin was never in effect, right? You can undo that because it's not like undoing, it's just saying kiddushin never had effect, because the kiddushin were only going to have effect if the ketubah, if they actually got married, and they never got married, so no. Okay, next. Fourth, Rabbi Shimon Korcha doresh lashon hedyot. Titania, Rabbi Shimon Korcha omer, hamaveh et chavero lo yimashkenenu yoter michovo. You lend someone money, let's say $100 loan, you can take a collateral only up to the amount of the loan. You can't take it for more than the amount of the loan. Where does he get this from? Shekach kotevlo. This is what people were writing contracts. Tashlum tedi'it lachalai kol kabil dechi. This payment that you have on me is equal in value to this item, okay? Equal in value, and not that the item is any more. So there you have it, that it has to be equal in value. Now, the Gemara assumes, now we're going to get off on a tangent, the Gemara assumes here that, why would they write this in the contract? Because, what basically they want to say, before we move on, is that if you darshan this language, and let's say you give a collateral that's worth 125, since you write in the contract the value of this loan is equal to the value of the item, then they can actually demand you give back 125. So that's why he was doresh lashon hedyot, and you have to make sure that your collateral is not more, because if it is, you're going to end up collecting more money. But they assume that the reason why people would write this is because they wanted to make sure it was written in the contract about the collateral, they could collect the collateral from the orphans, because you're not allowed to collect movables from orphans, and a loan is movable. So if you connect it to this collateral, you'll be able to collect it from the orphans. So they assumed, and then they're going to question that. Are you saying that the collateral will only be acquired to the owner if you say this language in the ketub in the contract, and if not, then it won't be acquired, which means that if the father if the lender dies, the children won't have to pay back the money and they won't have to give them the collateral because it's metal talin, and that's why they put this in, so that this is clearly connected to the loan, and even if the person dies, he'll be able to continue to have the collateral. But even without this, that would be the case, because Rabbi Yochanan says, we'll see this later on also on Kufir Dalid, Mishkeno v'heshivlo hamashkom v'meit shom tomei al gabei banav. If you take an item for collateral, now you're supposed to give it back if the person's poor every night. So you give it back every night, and then you take it back in the morning. What if you give it back, and then the father dies that night, and you want to take it back from the orphans? You're allowed to. Now, theoretically, you're not supposed to seize movable property from children, only land that they inherited, but not movable property for their father's loan. But yet it says, Shom tomei al gabei banav, because you took the mashkon in the beginning when the father was still alive, that mashkon is basically yours. Even if you return it technically at night, you still have rights to it, even if the orphans are now in charge. What do you see? You see that you don't need this language in the contract for that to happen. So why do you put this in the contract at all? Well, the answer, turning out on the bet, ahane ktiva legeraon. It's for the purposes of geraon, meaning you say at the beginning that this loan, which is $100, is equal to the value of this watch, which is $100 also. What if the watch goes down in value over time? Okay, if the watch goes down in value, it depreciates as you have it in your house. If the watch depreciates, slowly the band starts wearing away, right? It depreciates. Even if you don't use it, it depreciates. So, or depending on what the item is. If the item depreciates, well, if you didn't write in the loan, then you might say, well, look, if the guy defaults on the loan, you have the collateral and that's it. But if the collateral now depreciates, if you put in the contract that the collateral is exactly equal and now it's no longer equal, then you can insist that even if they default on the loan and don't give you the $100, but now let's say the watch is worth 90, you'll be able to collect those other 10. And that's why you put it in the contract. Okay, but that was an aside. Let's get back to what we were talking about, which is all an aside to our topic at large. We're now on the topic of doresh lashon hedyot, fifth and last one. Rabbi Yossi haya doresh lashon hedyot detanya. It says in the Braita, Rabbi Yossi omer, makom shnagu lasot kshuba milva, govet milva. There's different interpretations of the second part of this line, but we'll go with Rashi. If you live in a place where the ketubah becomes a loan, what does that mean? Well, what it means is, and we're talking about not the 200 zuzim of the ketubah, but the ketubah money of the dowry, meaning the wife brings in money to the marriage. It goes in the ketubah. This is the nichsei tzom barsel. And the husband commits that at the end of the, right, so basically first it's a commitment of the father of the bride to give this money to the couple. Then, which really goes to the husband in the meantime, the husband commits to give it back to the wife in the event of death or divorce. So what they say is this: if it's a place where the custom is that the ketubah is like a loan, that when the husband dies or divorces the wife, she can demand that money like a loan. It's like money owed to her, like a baal chov. She's someone who can demand that money. Then the husband can demand that money initially from the father-in-law. This is the point that there's a debate about what this means, gove milva. But we'll go with Rashi, that the husband at this point, okay, what happened? We wrote the ketubah, but the money didn't yet get transferred. The family didn't give the money yet. The husband can go demand it like a loan, okay, from the woman's family. That's what it's saying. Lichpol gove metzia. This is again, what here, it's not exactly lashon hedyot, but it's what the common people do. If people generally, okay, the father's family, the father of the bride says, I'm going to give $100,000 to the wedding, okay, as a dowry. Now, that if it's in a place where a lot of people exaggerate and they just say they're going to give a lot of money, but they don't really mean it. He's not really going to give them $100,000. He's really only going to give them half, $50,000. But he wants to look like he's a respectable person, so he adds to the number. Now, if it's a place where everybody does this, okay, it's kind of ironic, not ironic, but it's what was the point of everybody doing it, right? But people like to just use large amounts, and they would do double the amount. Then the husband can only demand half the amount because everybody knows that it's an exaggeration. In Nahar, that was a place, Gavu Tilta. They would even do a third because people would commit to 3 times the amount. So if they said $100,000, they would only get really $33,000. Okay, now 33,333 and a third. So Meir said, no, it was written that way. We're going to demand it. If you wrote that amount, the husband can go demand that amount. Amalei Ravina Meir, but how could you possibly say that? The Braita says, if you said, right, if the custom is everyone doubles it, then you only get half. Lo kashya, hada kanumine, hada lo kanumine. That all depends on whether you did a kinyan. If you committed that amount, father committed that amount to the couple, to the husband, and then they did a handkerchief, one of those raising of handkerchiefs, then it's a commitment. Then they have to give that amount that they said. But if not, then they don't have to. Right? I was thinking about, we do this tanaim, right? And they do a kinyan when they do the tanaim, and most people don't think it's binding. There are some people who think it's binding. Most people say it's really just ceremonial. But he claims, no, it could be, well, we do a kinyan, it's not, right? It's just a ceremony. It's not really meant to be taken seriously. But if it was a place where they take it seriously, and there are places where the tanaim is a very serious commitment and they do take it seriously, then that would be an indication of seriousness of purpose. And then again, you wouldn't do a kinyan on something that you didn't really mean to give. Again, this is all taloy b'minhag hamakom, as you see. Ravina mishbach b'katib lebarti. So Ravina added a lot of money to his daughter, but didn't really mean it. Amrulay nikne minei damar. So they said, let's do a kinyan with you. Ravina was smart, and he says to them, Amar lehu imikna lo michpal. If I'm going to do a kinyan, I'm not going to double the amount. Imichpal, if I'm going to do the double amount, though, lo mikna. Then I'm not going to do a kinyan. He was smart enough not to get caught in that trap and commit to double the amount. Another case about this. There was a case that happened. On his deathbed, he said to his sons, give 4, he said to people around, not clear, but give 400 zuz for my daughter for her ketubah. Now the big question becomes, what did he mean? Write in it 400 zuz, which really means only 200, or give her 400 zuz, which means write in the ketubah 800. So Shalach, obviously, the guy died, and we couldn't ask him what he meant. Shalach Rav Acha b'reid Rav Avi l'kamed Rav Ashi. So Rav Acha didn't know what to do. He sends to Rav Ashi, Arba mea di'inan timnimea, or Arba mea zuzei di'inu matayim. Is it 400? That's 800, meaning write 800 in the ketubah, really give her 400, or which, by the way, was a lot of money, 400, or 400 zuzim, which are really 200. And he meant write 400, but give her only 200. Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi says, and we're going to have 2 versions of what Rav Ashi said. First version, chazina, we look. Iyamar havle la, what did he say? It's not really look, we listen, right? We go back and we see what happened. If he said give her 400 zuz, then it means arba mea zuzei di'inim timnimea. It means 400, which is 800, because what he really meant is give her. Iyamar ktuvula, if he said write in her ketubah, then obviously he meant write in her ketubah 400, arba mea zuzei di'inu matayim, which is really only 200. Ika de amri, but some people say that Amar Rav Ashi chazina and Amar liktubata. It wasn't about give or write. It was for her ketubah. Then it would be arba mea zuzei de ite timnimea. If it's for her ketubah, then it means give her for her ketubah 400 zuz, which means write in the ketubah 800, but give her 400. V'iyamar biktubata, if he says in her ketubah, well, then it sounds like write in her ketubah, right? Arba mea zuzei di'ina matayim. Give her 400, which is really 200. But velohi, according to the second version, though, he thought to distinguish lit and bit, but then they rejected this and said, no, it's not true, though. Whatever he said isn't right, and really, they're actually going to go back to the first one, which is loshna, but it's not that Rav Ashi said it, it's that the Gemara comments on Rav Ashi. Loshna da'amar liktuba, loshna da'amar biktubata. It doesn't matter whether he said for her ketubah, in her ketubah, either which way. As soon as he mentions the word ketubah, arba mea zuzei di'ina matayim. It's clearly write it in the ketubah. That's what he means, 400, and really only give her 200. Ad da'amar, what's going to make us say the opposite? Unless he says havu lastam. If he doesn't, it's similar to the first, but it's a little different. If he doesn't mention the word ketubah at all, and he just says, give my daughter when she gets married 400, then we mean give her 400. But as soon as he mentions ketubah, we assume he means write in the ketubah this amount, but give her half though. Okay, that was all 5 times where we see someone who's darsh on lashon hedyot, which in and of itself is a very interesting topic. Like I said, you can listen to Rabbanit in on second thought this week and understand more about some other background to how seriously we take what people say, and this idea of actually darshing and saying if people say this, right, either this can become law, right, and this can become binding even if they don't say it, if like that's what's commonly done, or perhaps it means some other things, right, as we said before. Now we're going to go back to the topic in our Mishnah, which we immediately got off track, was if I take the land as a sharecropper and I decide not to work the land, I still have to pay. Okay, I have to pay the average, and that's just included in a basic contract of arisut, of sharecropping. So now we have a case where somebody said something a little different, and here we get to asmachta. Ha'u gavra tekabel ara mechadrin. He took land as a sharecropper from his friend, and he said the following statement: Amar, imovarna la. If I don't do anything, I just leave the land. Yahivna le alfa zuze. I'll give you 1,000 zuz, which is a huge amount of money and way more than the field should have produced. Ovir tilta, and the case happened that the person didn't work 1/3 of the land. They worked 2/3 of it, but they ignored 1/3 of the land. Amrin hardea, dina hu diyav letzlat me utzlatim betalta v'tilta. The law is he has to give a third. In other words, he worked 2/3 that he paid, but the other third he didn't work. Well, he said, if I don't work the land, I'll pay you 1,000 zuz. So he didn't work a third of the land. Let's divide, let's take a third of that 1,000, 333 and a third zuzim. That's what he has to pay. That's what they said in Nahardin. Rava Amal, Rava said, what are you talking about? Asmachta hi asmachta lo kanya. This is asmachta. This person never intended to do 1,000 zuz. Something happened. He didn't work the whole land, but he never intended. He thought from the beginning, I'm obviously going to do this, and therefore was just trying to convince the other side to give him the deal and let him be the sharecropper. So he made this exaggerated statement of, I'll do anything for you, and if I don't do it, I'll pay a huge amount of money, which of course he never intended. To which they say, well, the Rava, but what's the difference between that and the Mishnah? Here we get to the Gemara directly saying, which it doesn't always say in every case, and that's why there's all these theories about what makes something asmachta, what doesn't. But part of when they put the puzzle pieces together, this is one of the kisugyot. What's the difference between that and saying, if I don't work the field, I'm going to pay you the full amount? You also never intended there not to work the field. You were just saying it to get the guy to let you do it. Why there do we make you pay, and here you're not? So the answer, hatam lo kagazim. There you weren't exaggerating. You weren't promising an amount way more than what it was worth or what you would have produced. So if you're not exaggerating, right? Here you added. You could have just said, I'll pay you what I'm supposed to pay you. But instead you added this huge amount. You're totally exaggerating, and therefore it's not a meaningful statement. Now, many of the commentaries say you obviously still have to pay what the field would have produced. You just don't have to pay the 1,000 zuz, because there's the basic law of you anyway need to pay, right? Even if you didn't say this, that was the whole doresh, lashon, hedyot. At least if we understand Rabbi Meir as this becomes halakha, even if you didn't say it, right? So that also really depends. Do you have to pay anything? Do you have to pay, right? Or not? Maybe you don't. It's a big, right? Do we just ignore this statement and only if you make the statement? Anyway, there's a big debate there. We're not going to get into that. But this is one of the key sugyot, like I said, about asmachta, because asmachta is exaggeration. Now, the problem is, it's not always exaggerated, asmachta cases. So because of that, it sounds like there's a simple definition. If it's an exaggerated amount, then it's asmachta. If not. Well, that helps only in certain cases, because there's other cases of asmachta where there wasn't an exaggeration and yet it was still asmachta. Okay, we're going to have a few more cases here. Somebody took land to be a sharecropper and grow sesame. Now, sesame is bad for the land. It's it's a very profitable business, but it ruins your land. So it's like people who like short-term profit, it's great. For the long term, it's not so good because when they grow, they apparently weaken the ground, the soil. So you became a sharecropper, and the whole deal was you were going to grow sesame, zarachite, but instead you grew wheat, which is less profitable. But somehow you had a very good season, or the price of grains went up, and you produced wheat that made you the same amount of money as sesame, and it didn't ruin the land. So Rav Kahana said, I think that the sharecropper can deduct some of the profits they were supposed to share with the owner. If they were going to give them a third, they could give them a quarter. Because in the end, the owner will only get a quarter of the profits, but he'll end up with land that's better for the next season. So we should be able to deduct that from what the sharecropper has to pay. So Rav Ashi says to Rav Kahana, a very interesting line. Amrle Rav Ashi, Rav Kahana, Amri, and actually people say, you can weaken my land. I don't really care about the weakened land. I'm looking for today. I want the money I was supposed to make. I was supposed to make a third of the value of sesame. The fact that my land will be better for next year, that's not what I'm thinking about right now. Let's translate literally. Weaken my land, v'lo kach shamara, but don't weaken me. I don't want to be weakened anymore. Okay, don't weaken me. I want to make what I was supposed to make. And therefore, you have to give them the original amount. Another case similar. Again, you took it to grow sesame, and you did wheat again, but this time, you actually made more. You made it more profitable than it would have been if it was sesame. Again, Ravina thought to say, just like before Rav Kahana thought to say, that the sharecropper gets all the extra profit because the owner was going to get X. They should still just get X. But Amarle Rabachami Difti Ravina, Atu Eshbach, what? You think it's all because of the sharecropper? Ara lo eshbacha, and it wasn't the good soil that belonged to the original owner that also helped it grow better. So no, we're not going to deduct, prevent the sharecropper from getting the full profit. I'm sorry, the owner from getting the full profits. The owner gets the profits as the percentages we originally said, even though now they're getting more money. Okay, it's not all the sharecroppers doing. Now we're going to go back to, as I told you before, we're going back to this heiter iska that we discussed a lot in chapter 5, and it's good review because it was complicated, and maybe now we'll learn it again. Amr naharda, hi iska, palga milva, palga pikadon. You remember this? How do you do an essay? If I want to give money to you to invest for me, I give you money, and we view it as half of it is a loan, which means you assume responsibility. If anything happens to it, you have to return me the original amount. And half of it is viewed as a pikadon, as if I'm giving you something of mine to watch and I get it back, whatever profits it makes, it's mine to make. So I then don't make any interest on the loan because the loan gets back to me as is. The profits on the loan part you get. The profits on the pikadon I get. And in that way, it doesn't look like repeat that I gave you money and I get it back later with more. Because the part I get back more of, I assume responsibility for. A loan, you assume responsibility. So the part I get back, I assume responsibility. And because of that, I actually can take that back with the profits. But there's one other thing, which is, so basically it means we each split the losses 50-50, and we each split the proceeds 50-50. But when I give you the money, and then I get it back later at a higher, right? I get back more. Okay, so if we do this half pikadon, half milva, we're good, except for one thing. You're working for me and I'm not paying you, which means that I'm getting more benefit, which means it's like interest because I'm getting more benefit for giving you money for a long period of time. So what do we have to do? Well, usually the way they would do it is either I have to pay you an amount, which I could do, or they often built it into the deal, which is that when it comes to the profits, I make 1/3 of the profits and you make 2/3. Okay, so in that sense, you're going to take a cut of my profits on the pikadon part, basically, is what we're saying. Okay, so the losses are on us equally. The profits are not equal. I'm going to make less profits, and that covers the fact that I won't be taking interest by having you work for me for free. So I'm going to hard that. This iska is palga milva palga pikadon. And therefore, Abid Rabbana Milta Denichale Lelove Benichale Lamalve. In other words, they did this in a way that it's good for both sides because they both equally assume responsibility for losses. Hashadamrina Palapa Milve. But now that we said that half of it is a loan, now when I give you money as a loan, you can do with it whatever you want, right? The main deal is you have to give me back the exact amount that I gave you. I don't care what you do with the money. As long as you give me back my money, what do I care? So if I give you all my money to invest and we view half as a pikadon and half as a loan, well, the half that's a loan, they come and say, you could do whatever you want with that part. You have to invest my money because that's why I gave it to you. But the part that we view as if I'm loaning you money, the pikadon part, for sure you have to invest. And that's the part I'm making profits on. But if you want to take your share that's considered the loan that you're assuming responsibility for and just waste it on beer, go for it. Okay, that's yours to do what you want with it. Rava Amal, what are you talking about? Lahachi karale iska. This is called an investment. This is not. Yes, we're couching it in half milva, half pikadon, but it's not really a loan. It's just the way we're doing business here to make sure we can do business properly. I could say to you, yes, I gave you that money and we're considering it a loan, but no, I gave it to you to invest. I want you to invest all that money. I don't want you to invest part and drink beer with the rest of it. Okay, we're gonna have another thing where Rava disagrees again. I'm Rabbi Idi Baravin, the inmate, Nasamatatalin Eitzel Banav. Idi Baravin says the milva also, if you have a loan out and there's no land, let's say, in the father's possession, it's like metaltalin, and the orphans don't have to give it back. Comes Rav and he says, no, again, it's a bit fictitious, this whole thing. It's not exactly fictitious, but it's a way we came up with a loophole, but it's not really a loan. Lahachi karole iska. Again, Rava keeps saying, this is why we call it a heiter iska. It's a banat, that we view this as a business deal. And if the guy dies, the investor, of course, the children have to give it back. It's not viewed as movables. Amar Rava. Last point for today, iska utresh dare. Okay, this is kind of this case is a little simpler. Tomorrow it'll be a little more complicated. What you'll see later in about another half hour, I'll put up tomorrow's stuff. I use the whiteboard in the YouTube, so you might want to watch it if you usually listen, because it'll be helpful to see this all written out. Anyway, today's a little simpler, so we'll go with this without the whiteboard. But iska utresh dare pseda malve tre iske v'chad dare pseda delov. Because we have this arrangement, 50-50 losses, right? We share the losses, but when it comes to profits, I gave you the money, I get only a third of the profits, you get 2/3. Well, if we take, okay, we're going to have two opposite cases. One deal, I give you 200, but we write it in two different contracts. Okay, we split it into 100 for whatever reason. I don't know why we did this, but if we do it that way, I will take a loss. And if we had two business deals and decided to put them in one contract, you will take a loss on that if you're the one who I gave the money to invest. Why? Let's just do the simple math. We'll do it in a case where I gave you 200. We split it up into two contracts, 100. One went down by 60 and one went up by 60. Now, if one goes down by 60 and one goes up by 60 in the end, really there's no gain, no loss. If we did it in one deal, and it was one deal, but we put it in one contract, we'd all end up with our, right? It would, like, this is, let's say, a case where we each gave 100, okay? Or either which way, the loss would be equally on both of us, okay? It doesn't matter whether I give you all the money, but we'd each be back to square one. But if we split into two contracts and one goes down 60, so now we split the losses, each of us are down 30. But the one that goes up 60, I make only a third and you make 2/3. So you're going to be up 40, down to I'm up 20, which in the end means you're going to be up 10 from the whole deal. So instead of being at 0-0, you're up 10 and I'm down. Okay, that's the first case. If it's 2 iskaot, then that's what it should be. You should gain 10 and I'll be minus 10. But if we put it all into one star, then we'll be at 0-0, and then the loss will be on you because you won't get your plus 10. So that's how Rava ends with that case. We're going to have other things Rava has to say about these iskaot. Clearly has a lot to say today. So let's just quickly review. We started with the case of the irrigated field. We talked about the different languages and what the responsibility, the contradiction with the Braita. Then we moved to someone who doesn't work in the field. And then we said, well, that's because people write in the contract and that becomes law. And then we saw 5 cases where lashon hedyot we take very seriously. And then we went on from there to, what if you say, I'll pay you 1,000 zuz, right? That's an exaggeration, that's asmachta. And from there, we got to some other cases of arisut. And then from there, somehow they got back to heiter iska, perhaps because Rava had these unique approaches here. And we were talking about Rava before, and how we do this heiter iska. And kept saying, no, you're wrong. That's why we call it an iska. And it's basically there to protect the person who's investing their money. With that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everybody a Chag Sameach. See you after Chag.